Happy New Year. Happy 2022.
Feliz Ano Novo.
Feliz Ano Novo. We're going to try to do better this year. How about that?
Episode
As a species. 185, something like that,
So.
36, 85, 86, something like that. Today is a quite an important paper I want to discuss. Idea I want to discuss. So usually those things I read them a little bit and then I translate because they use fancy words. But it's actually, I'm going to use one study because it's a meta study. Really means it's a composition of things which is about like 5,000 participants. So it's quite a large number. They went at a subject and looked from the Dutch actually have done a lot of work on that. The Americans as well. So what is the subject? The subject is obesity and depression. So first let me give a background to that. There's been quite a lot of studies on obesity and depression, and sometimes it's been very contradictory, where some were showing that obesity leads to depression, others not at all. So unfortunately this has been in a way politicized by the woke people, saying like, see, obesity has no effects on mental disorders. It's both true and false. So, and this is what I want that study to talk about. So first of all, the problem became that we were using very general terms that were not leading to us being able to have the proper conclusions. So what do I mean by that? On one side there was obesity. Obesity is a very vague term because, for example, if you look at BMI, the body mass index, it's going to give you a very slanted answer. For example, technically I'm obese because I'm 230 at 6 foot tall. That makes me obese. So there's a different variance toward that we're going to talk about today. And then the problem is also the idea of depression. Depression is a freeze mode, right? So that's what the complication is. It depends how you measure it. And on top of it,
More depression as a state than as an illness.
Right, exactly. So you have, as an illness, you have what is usually called major depression disorder, MDD, right? Which is people that are really at the bottom of the hole. That's one, and that's not relating to obesity. What you have is you have a type of depression, but you have two types. One that is called the somatic affective depression, which is I have low energy, I don't feel like doing anything, which is almost like a physical depression. So again, physical mode of the freeze mode. And then you have what is called a cognitive depression, which is like you're down, you lost a spouse, you look at yourself in a very negative way, things like that.
Fired,
right, but it's not like I have low energy, it's like I'm actively almost putting myself down type of thing. That's called a cognitive symptoms toward depression. So
is then cognitive something
more like a mental thing, if you want.
Is it then more often things that happen to you that you have no control?
It depends. Like I would look at it of prediction versus observation. Like the somatic is a depression on the observation side that leads to the problem, whereas the cognitive is from the prediction side that leads to the problem. So either the prediction doesn't match the observation or the observation doesn't match the prediction, but it depends on which side the problem is. So for example, somatic would be like my mind is great but my body has no energy. I feel like my body just does not answer me even though my mind is great. Or you have the cognitive, which means my body is great but my mind just doesn't want to go that well. You know what I mean? So your girlfriend left you, cognitive, right? In that case, I'm fat, I have no energy to do anything, somatic. Affective depression in a way, you would call it like that. So that's a problem with when that subject was covered, is that if you don't make a difference between somatic and cognitive, and if you don't make a difference on what obese means, you cannot do a proper study. And so I'm very happy because that's actually what they went at, and they were precise enough that we can actually get some cool relationship out of all this. So I'm going to read a little bit and then translate as you go. So you tell me which part is not obvious. I mean, none of it is, but anyway. Background, growing evidence. So the name of the study is Associations Between Depression and Different Measures of Obesity, BMI, WC, WHTR, and WHR.
And it will be able to be found in a fold, right?
Yeah, it's in the Strongfit Vault, and then I'll put the link on YouTube. I'll put the link in the comment section. Yeah, and you should read it, honestly. Growing evidence suggests that abdominal obesity is a more important risk factor for the prognosis of cardiovascular and metabolic diseases than BMI. All right, so that sentence alone is awesome. What they're saying right here is that BMI is not a good way of measuring if you're fat or not. Yeah, no shit, because you can have a lot of muscle.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's say like if I was 120 kilos of steroid muscle but very lean, I'll be technically obese.
Yeah.
So what they're saying is that's not a good way to measure as a prognosis of cardiovascular and metabolic diseases. What seems to be is what they call abdominal obesity, so the waist size. That's what WHTC means.
The waist size means?
Waist.
Yeah, what is the name for that in this?
WHTR. It's a waist to hip ratio.
And that's very important for the rest
that
of
seems to be what this means. So the whole, what this, and again, read it, right? But what this is stating really is that it's fat at the midsection that seems to be key to everything. It's not fat overall, it's the midsection. So there's very interesting other facts that come into this study that is very interesting. Where I talked about before, and it's something Jordan Peterson discussed, that there is a direct relationship between inflammation and depression. I can't remember which podcast I talked about that, but it was there. It's been proven time and time again that high levels of inflation have a direct correlation with depression. It's been proven. So there's never causation. Causation is hard to figure out with that, but correlation always. We've seen that inflammation, cytokines produced in the stomach, stuff like that, they all seem to be related to high levels of depression. Right. And there's also another layer to that, which was shown by the Dutch, again, in that study, which I think is a Gutenberg, which is was Gutenberg Dutch? The Gutenberg Press, was it Dutch?
I have no clue.
Or at least Dutch descent?
You're the brain in this podcast, I have no idea.
Guten,
what's his name?
The Gutenberg Association is, I believe, Dutch. I think it's at the...
Sounds Dutch or German.
Yeah, it's at the Dutch, Holland-Belgium border. Anyway, they do a lot of studies on the gut flora. And in one of their studies, they were coming to the conclusion that it was like over 85% of the people that they studied, and we're talking over 3,000, had depression, were lacking a very specific bacteria in their gut flora, 2 types of colonies in their gut flora, and a high percentage of that was associated, of those people was associated with depression. So what they were showing here on all the studies that they've done,
how fascinating is that?
Yes, is that it seems to be fat around the stomach that determines cardiovascular problems later, like all the hypertension and stuff like that, and metabolic diseases, so diabetes, like again high blood pressure, you're gonna have to have all the issues associated with that. But it seems it also determines the somatic depression, the freeze mode, like I have low energy, my body is not reacting. That seems to be relating to in a way, your waist to hip ratio, in the sense of how much fat you carry in the midsection.
Yeah, but so if the gut is inflamed, your stomach is pushing forward. Is that also? Okay,
so that one.
Is that also part of it, or is that a stupid question?
No, it's not a stupid question, because, for example, why do bodybuilders have such large stomach, even though they're so lean? Like they shove a lot of food, but they don't eat that much in preparation. So how come those very lean bodybuilders have such huge stomach? And some people will go, well, they take growth hormone that enlarge the organs. The problem is that was tested, and the organs were not any bigger than before because of growth hormone. Once they start losing the weight, their waist are shrinking. So it seems like, is it the drugs? Is it the eating too much? Good question.
But it's also
is that eating too much inflaming certain things? Because there are also muscle right here that are relating to the sympathetic nervous system. That could be, it could be that it's not that you have control of your stomach. It's that literally your stomach is pushing forward because of sympathetic reaction.
Well, I heard before that people who are stressed out have a certain sympathetic reaction,
right,
even on minor things, like not that they have an inflamed stomach as in the bodybuilders, but like pre-signs of feeling that the stomach is pushing forward a little bit when stressed out.
But that's a 4-pack. That's actually an exercise we use with oblique opener and everything. So there's an entire relationship there that I think exists that one is more touchy. So I'm going to stay with that because that one is simpler to talk about, but I think there is a much deeper conversation to have about that. Like, I'll refer to the Greeks who were explaining that, you know, health starts in the stomach. Well, it turns out, yeah. So it seems that, again, like the waist, so what they call that, abdominal obesity, is the key factor to all this, to depression, to metabolic diseases and all that stuff.
So to say the size of your stomach.
Of your stomach, yeah.
It's like to say it very bluntly.
Right, so it's not about getting leaner, it's about getting your stomach smaller. Is that why we all have a fascination with a six-pack?
That's what I was thinking.
Is that why bodybuilders that do the vacuum impress everybody?
That's what I was thinking. Like, if you look, that's what everyone wants, a six-pack, or it's what everyone...
Flat stomach. Yeah. Because you have a guy who's very lean, but a round stomach, no one finds that attractive, appealing. Like the bodybuilders, when they have a big stomach, you go like, who cares, you look fat.
It's even like if you see women with short tops, they always are more intimidating to other women than women who wear...
They don't need abs, they just need a flat stomach.
Yeah.
A flat stomach has...
a certain type
of attraction. So is it possible that the attraction is not just sexual, that it's that human being intrinsically know that it represents a mental health thing? That the smaller your waist, the sharper you are mentally. So people are going to get upset saying, are you saying like fat people are not smart? Actually, I did a podcast on that. I was showing that obesity and a certain type of intelligence was also related. What I'm saying is like being obese is bad for you. That's what I'm saying.
But if you even look on a learning...
Worse, makes you worse. Not bad for you, because I don't like to go in good and bad. Being obese makes things worse for you.
Yeah. But even if you think, not even on the person, like if you ingest a lot of sugar and carbs, it will be harder to concentrate and harder to learn.
Right. By the way, speaking of that, this is a two-part podcast because next week we're going to go on another paper that was showing that insulin resistance and depression is also linked. So that one as well. Yeah. But this one, that's going to be the first part, is going to be just about your waist size, your abdominal obesity, and the levels of depression who happens to be related.
Well, if people get upset, like it's everyone's own choice what they look like and what they want to look like.
No, but you can do whatever you want. That's not the problem.
On the way they look, everyone's...
Right. No, that's not the problem. The problem isn't that. The problem is people are saying that there are no consequences to being obese now. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. It's like that 350-pound like insane woman was declaring she had anorexia. And she keeps eating like entire pizzas and top of ice cream and stuff like that. I'm like, you do whatever you want. What you do not have the right to say that it's not bad for your health. Yeah. It's the difference between an opinion and an accusation, right? Everybody's entitled to an opinion. This is the internet. You want to call me stupid, ugly? You can. What you cannot is call me a rapist. That's an accusation. That you have to prove. Right, so it's the same thing. You want to be fat, you want to be obese? Sure, have at it. What you cannot do is say that it's not dangerous to your health. Mm-hmm. That you cannot do. That you have to prove, right? And everything we look at is showing that there is a direct correlation between waist size and depression. So that means that the best thing we can do for our clients, going back to training, is getting them leaner, a little bit more practical than that, is making them lose that abdominal fat, basically. Because we're not talking about just fat between, like right here, we're talking about the fat inside, in between your organs. There's a lot of fat in between your organs, and it seems when it grows too much, maybe, by the way, it's pushing the organs out of place, which would create a problem. Again, there are sympathetic muscle and receptors right here on the side of the stomach that maybe gets activated when things starts to go too big. I believe there are very specific safeguard system built in the stomach where when it starts to go past a certain size, it activates certain things. I've seen it time and time again. So the size of your stomach seems to say something about your overall health. Physical, obviously, but it seems mental as well. So I think maybe that's why we're so interested in small waist. It's,
if you, like, let's be honest, if you see someone with a very small stomach, there is a certain type of confidence.
It's at least
impressive.
And if the person carries muscle, you go, ooh, and then you can say whatever you want. Like, let's be honest, at the Olympics, we look at the sprinters, we look at all those guys, you go like, well, shit, look at that, he has muscles and a small waist. Isn't that what bodybuilding is based on? Yeah. The appealing physique is the guy with broad shoulders, small waist. Because that combination is very hard. It shows you mental strength and physiological strength, it seems. And apparently mental strength as well, on top of physical and physiological. Somatic affective symptoms of depression. So somatic affective symptoms means I have low energy. Have also been linked to cardiovascular risk. Yeah, the relationship between obesity and depression, however, has remained contradictory because of the fact that we did not define obesity well or depression. Our aim was therefore to relate body mass index, BMI, and different measure of abdominal obesity. Waist circumference, so that's a WC, waist to hip ratio, WHR, waist to height ratio, WHTR, to somatic versus cognitive affective symptoms of depression. So, very interesting. In a cross-sectional population-based study, data on the first 5,000 participants, so large enough, I would say, to get at least some conclusion out of it, enrolled in the Gutenberg Health Study, are reported to analyze the relationship between depression and obesity, blah, 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 blah. Results. We found that only the somatic and not the cognitive symptoms of depression are consistently positively associated with the anthropometric measures of obesity. So it means that I have low energy is associated with the waist being thicker ratio. Conclusions. We could demonstrate that the somatic affective symptoms of depression rather than the cognitive affective symptoms are strongly related to anthropometric measures. This is also true for younger obese starting at the age of 35 years. Well, they haven't been to the States, obviously. That's why this is in Holland. In the States, you can find them way younger than that. Our results are in line with previous studies indicating that visceral adipose tissue plays a key role in a relationship between obesity, depression, and cardiovascular disease. So the key is that. The key is visceral adipose tissue, visceral fat. That seems to be the key factor to all of this. So it's not so much, the problem with the body fat percentage that we do is we measure at the waist here, but we also measure at the pec. We measure at different places like that. The amount of fat you have here does not seem to be to relate to cardiovascular or metabolic diseases or depression. It's the waist that matters. It's the visceral fat. So I don't necessarily think it's the amount of fat that you carry outside that matters nearly as much as the visceral fat in between your organs. Because when you get fatter around the waist here, that's not the only place that gets fatter. That means the fat within your organs starts to develop as well. And I think that's actually probably the biggest factor of all is that.
Well, if the organs get compromised by the amount of fat, you could see that the body starts to freak out and it affects
and it goes into freeze. The why is going to be hard to pinpoint on that one. Yes, I agree with you on that one. Yes, when you have too much fat in between your organs, it starts to go into freeze. The question is why. It's always about the questions, right? All right, so does that mean because at some point displacing the organs is pushing the organs away from each other? Does that start to change the structure? Is that why? If that's why, then that means we have sensors in place to make sure that certain organs cannot move past certain, like degrees of closeness or things like that. Is that what's happening? Like some organs need to be close to each other. When you start to push too much, it involves, is that what's happening? So they are sensors, so therefore we can measure it. Like that opens so many doors. Great questions, by the way. But so that means that the more we keep those organs together, the better we would do. Again, so that means about getting smaller waist. Then, right, but then that would affect how we train people. Like the smallest, my waist is always smaller when I do the 10 minutes on the airline, more than running. For me, why? Because, airline is this for 10 minutes non-stop, which means we need to do way more rotational upper body work toward longer distances or longer time in order to have a smaller waist, which is maybe what we would see with CrossFit. Or at least when CrossFit had rotational exercise. When they don't have rotational exercise, you see thicker waists, depending on how they program. Depending on what the regionals look a certain year, you can always tell what the next year is going to look like because the women would get thicker waist as they started to do Olympic weightlifting and just gymnastics. Everything was in straight line. That's something I talked about forever. If you look at one of the biggest problems with CrossFit is not the system, the sport, right? Because the system, it was all movements. The sport at some point was Olympic weightlifting and gymnastic work on bar or rings. So everything was in one plane of movement, up and down, right? And on top of it, there was no rotation whatsoever in CrossFit. Like seriously, where do you see rotation? Outside of the split jerk from the rotation of the lower body, you don't see any. There's no rotation. There's no rotation. That means that this can remain static. So then suddenly you see them run. They don't rotate. They just run like blocks, right?
Yeah.
You know that you've seen them run as a runner. There's absolutely no movement through the core. No movement through the core means like there is no, that movement. There's certain muscles that don't get developed, and you don't get rid of then the visceral fat as much as you would with more rotation. And again, the muscles are not developed, so like I know they say there's no spot reduction, but that's not true either. So
and you also don't develop all the small muscles, right?
All the small muscles that need to be required, and muscle burn, calories, and like there's a sympathetic innervation that goes to the fat that needs to be, and that's where spot reduction comes from. Is that sympathetic innervation? I made plenty of podcasts on that, the melanocortin axis. So that means that if you were to activate those muscles, you would have a lesser sympathetic reaction in that region, most likely. Again, all that is not proven because it's not tested, because we just don't go there. But to me, that's all the doors that are opening, going like, easy to test. Let's start incorporating more rotation and see if it works. It works for me on the airline for 10 minutes, I gotta say.
If you see sports that have a lot of natural rotation, without lifting, they have a six-pack and they look very lean. Like if you say, swimming is rotation, right, of the abs?
Well, they would be.
Yeah.
Because they do this so much, because it's one arm at a time. Yeah.
And those types of.
But they extend it too and everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anytime you have unilateral.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like a lot of runners have a really small waist.
Yeah, but that's different. It's because they need to be light in order to run stuff. But there's for example, sprinters. There's a very hard rotation. They need to be light, but there's a very hard rotation when they turn fighters. Boxing. Yeah, exactly.
They all have for the lack of strength training they do.
Kickboxing.
Yeah, kickboxing. They have usually all abs.
Yeah. Yeah, more
even
than that,
though
small
they're
waist.
Gigantic.
Small waist, because bodybuilders, for example, don't do rotation. They have abs, but they don't have small waist.
Yeah, and if they do cardio, it's only lining.
But that brings a question as to why also the Q-1 works so well, like at least for me. Maybe it's because it was incorporating rotation. Maybe every time I did the Q-1, my waist got smaller. Maybe that helped also. That helped me getting in a better fight mentally. So is it
that the state gets better while you do cardio that it helps? Because
no, it's a state like 2 hours after I'm capable of doing work. I'm not if I don't do it. So that's it. Welcome to the body though. It's never one thing.
Yeah.
Ever.
No, that's a mistake I always make.
Right. So that we were talking about that this morning. Is like, is it the chicken or is it the egg? Like, there is no answer to that question without context. You cannot answer a chicken and the egg question without introducing the context of evolution, starting on a unicellular organism. So it's going to be the same answer to this. What does it mean? Well, in itself, not that much, because it means a lot. It means like the waist size matter, but it opens up so many doors, so many things that now we have to start incorporating. So, for example, the Q-1, I still think like that giving a 6 is a very important part, but it seems that maybe the choice of the airdyne and making my waist smaller has also helped me. So let me put it this way, the Q-1 on an airdyne would work for me because there is the giving a 6 mentally, that prediction side of things, but I would also fix, you see how violent she is? Like, I looked at a mosquito, that's a wife right there. Anyway, so that give me a 6, right? That Q-1 idea would be from the prediction perspective, but maybe that constant rotation, losing the fat around the stomach, would give me the benefits on the observation side of things. So the Q-1 would be a good way to go at cognitive-based depression, whereas the Q-1 on the airdyne will, through the rotation, will allow me to go at the somatic symptoms from the observation side of depression. So maybe that's why the Q-1 works so well on an airdyne. You know what I mean? Yeah. I know, it opens so many doors, right? Right, and then you go, so which one it is? Well, all of them. And that's the problem with the system. It's always a combination of things, always. Again, it opens up so many doors, right? And that just at that idea of everything being in the waist. So, visceral adipose tissue seems to play a key role in cardiovascular diseases, obesity and depression. As reviewed by Shelton and Miller, the underlying inflammatory mechanisms are complex and not fully understood. Yeah, because then there's that also, there's also now the thing with inflammation that also gets into all this, so there's another layer to that. Studies have shown that visceral fat produces a higher amount of cytokines than subcutaneous fat. Right. So high levels of cytokines such as TNF-alpha, you don't need to know that, have been found both in visceral obesity and in depression. This finding has been replicated consistently. An unhealthy lifestyle, diabetes, and inflammation induces vascular damage in the brain, which may also lead to depression symptoms. Right. So translation. That's the podcast I was doing about inflammation and depression. So it seems that visceral fat, so the fat between your organs, produce more of the inflammatory factors. The cytokines, you don't need to know what it is, doesn't matter. But let's call it inflammatory factors. I have to oversimplify a bit, but let's call it inflammatory factors. So the visceral fat, so in between your organs, produce more of the inflammatory factors than subcutaneous, so the fat below the skin. So again, that's what I was saying earlier. It's not the fat around your waist as much as in your waist that matters. If you have a lot of visceral fat in between the organs, it creates an inflammatory response. That inflammatory response can go all the way to the brain, and we've seen that inflammation in the brain being linked to depression, which makes sense if depression is a freeze mode. If your brain starts to get inflammatory agents too much, it's going to start to shut down everything as to not get damaged by it. That makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So now we're introducing the idea of inflammation in the middle of that. So visceral fat seems to be the evil we all need to eradicate. Yeah. So not subcutaneous fat, so not the fat between the skin nearly as much as the fat between the organs.
The inflammation is
one of the things that having so much fats in between your organs will create.
And is a sign of inflammation to the body a sign of illness?
No, it's a sign. It's like a sympathetic reaction. It's like inflammation. You get cut, you get red at first. That's an inflammation that is there because the sympathetic system is doing everything it can to kill the germs that enter the body from the outside. That's why we have skin, is to not let that happen, right? So it starts to fight. That inflammation is necessary for healing process. So any healing process starts with inflammation. That's why it's a mistake to take anti-inflammatories and stuff like that, because you're stopping the healing process, which you don't want to do. Inflammation is good up until it isn't. So some inflammation is a sign of healing. If you keep eating sugar or shit, have an unhealthy lifestyle, of course you're going to have inflammation because your body needs to heal the damage you're doing to it. The problem is at some point it becomes so imbalanced that inflammation, instead of being on your side, starts to go against you. The inflammation in the brain means even your brain is being affected by all of that for other factors as well. It's just an incredibly complex machine. But you start to get the small, like watchtowers, like light towers here and there that start to point you in the right direction, where you start to go, oh, this happened, and then that happened. But they're all pointing that light toward the same direction, which is the waste, the visceral fat. That seems to be a big one. Another potential mechanism linking obesity and depression is a dysregulation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So yeah, no shit. So dysregulation of a huge axis toward hormonal production, if you want. The relations between obesity and comorbid mental conditions are still discussed controversially. An increased prevalence of depression and other mental disorders in obese was found in several studies and confirmed by a meta-analysis including 17 communities-based studies with more than 200,000 participants. The causal link between depression and obesity is supposed to be bidirectional, which means depression will lead to obesity, obesity will lead to depression. So that it's a feedback loop that just feeds itself, unfortunately, on top of it. Others, however, could not find an increased prevalence for mental disorders in the obese at all. However, only few studies have compared different anthropometric measures, even though they are quantitative, non-invasive, and easy to determine techniques for determining body fat composition. So what he's saying is like that the studies that were saying that is not true, we can't see a link between mental disorder and obesity, we're basing probably obesity on BMI. But if you look at BMI, you can have, again, pro bodybuilder technically is obese, even when he's at his leanest, because the BMI is a terrible way of determining obesity. So the problem was not that the link does not exist. The problem was that
that's another good measurement.
The measurement of obesity used in that study was incorrect. Yeah. Because basically what really this means is that BMI is just a very, very poor way of measuring anything and should not be used. Yeah. What we need to go is waist to height ratio, waist to hip ratio. There are ways to measure that would give us a much better picture than BMI. All he says that BMI is shit. But if you were one to politicize every argument on the woke side and a social justice warrior, and you wanted to prove that being obese is perfectly fine for your health, you would use BMI as a way to measure it, saying, see, can't prove it, which is what's happening in today's world as usual. So, recent studies have shown that somatic affective, feeling tired or having little energy, but not cognitive affective, feeling down, depressed or hopeless, symptoms of depression predicted poor medical outcomes of patients with cardiovascular disease. Right, so that depression does not kill from like, I feel down, I feel hopeless, is not what kills you. I have low energy, my body doesn't want to do what I want, that's what kills you, right? So it's the somatic symptoms that show problems, not the cognitive from a physiological perspective.
Because
so again,
cognitive is
because it's the body in freeze, not the mind.
But the cognitive is also not only, but most of the time when something happens, like your spouse dies, right? Or
mentally, it's your mental approach. So what they're saying really is like, so somatic is your body in freeze versus your mind in freeze. Your spouse dies, your mind goes to freeze, right? Your body is fine, but your mind isn't. The other way, somatic means that your body goes to freeze, not your mind. Like I feel great, but mentally, but physically, I feel like shit. That's again the problem. That's why it's complicated, because it's not just one type of depression. And by the way, there's a retarded depression versus the anxious depression. And now you have the somatic symptoms versus the cognitive symptoms. That's why this shit is so complicated, because we cannot say there's one thing. It's always an arch. Everything is an arch. It's prediction versus observation. So they're saying that the depressed body shows you the death rate going up, the metabolic insults, as they call it, leading to death, is the body in freeze, not the mind in freeze. So we need to get the body out of freeze, and visceral fat is a major component of that. Get on the iodine.
Well, it also shows you how important exercise is.
Exactly. Contradictory findings regarding the relationship between obesity and depression may be due to A, the different measure of obesity, exactly, BMI versus abdominal fat, the different measures of depression, especially somatic versus cognitive, yeah, exactly what I say, and potential sex differences. By the way, that too, men versus women, that's another factor that matters a lot. It's not the same.
Can you explain?
Let me do it next week then, because it seems like we react differently to all that. It seems that men are more on the observation side, women are more on the prediction side. Women get lost in their head a lot, men in their body. But that seems to be a fundamental difference between men and women, like going back to the male versus female energy. There's another factor relating to that. If you start to go cognitive based, then men and women will not react the same to the same things.
So actually we have 2 more podcasts to make on the subject.
Well, I mean, yeah, or 150, because like this is so complex, like you never done. I can do a 6 podcasts on each paper, and we still could. There's so many ideas that interlink all those other ones. It would just never end. I mean, that's why it never ends. Right. So this is so. Then we got to go back to the paper where they explain the method, the primary outcome measures, and things like that. So that's already heavy, I think. So what we're gonna do, let's do this. Like we're gonna cut short just as an intro to that, because I want to do a podcast on the inflammation again, relating to that. Then we'll do a podcast on the insulin sensitivity and depression, and then we can also do a podcast after that on the men versus women and how that toward depression. Because that way, I feel like this subject is so important. It's going to take us we're going to need a number of podcasts. So there's no need for me to run too much out of that one, since we're going to have to do so many of them in a row. Sounds good? So let's stop there on the first one, because it's already 30 minutes. It's a lot of stuff to already integrate. You have to read the paper. Then next week we continue, because I want to introduce that idea of insulin resistance and depression and then inflammation, and then gender.
Yeah.
And then we can go back at the paper and then summarize the whole thing.
Yeah, and then we can even do a stupid podcast episode about it, answering questions about it.
Perfect. I like it. Bye, everybody.
Bye.